I've been pretty hard on Family Guy this year, but in my defense, this show has some really bizarre episodes. When you've been on the air for over 20 seasons, things are bound to get a little crazy from time to time. Whether it's an episode that pretends to kill off a main character or a bottle episode that is woefully tone deaf, there are plenty of oddities to talk about when it comes to Family Guy. And while some of the odd episodes I've talked about this year I've had a negative opinion on, today I want to talk about my favorite oddity in all of Family Guy, the Rhode 2 series of episodes. The Rhode 2 episodes of Family Guy are a collection of 8 episodes inspired by the Rhode 2 movies starring Bing Crosby and Bob Hope.
We're off on the road to Morocco.
Except instead of using Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, Family Guy uses Brian and Stewie as its comedy duo. And it's not exactly the kind of episodes people may expect from a long-running show like Family Guy.
We're off on the road to Rhode Island.
But this setup works insanely well. The Rhode 2 episodes of Family Guy are some of my favorites in the entire series. And I'm not alone in thinking this. These are some of the most beloved episodes of Family Guy, period. The episodes are all fun adventures featuring Brian and Stewie in a new environment with some kind of problem to solve. There is so much variety and so many fun story ideas in these episodes that it's honestly kind of crazy, and it's clear that Seth MacFarlane and the team behind Family Guy really loved the feeling of the Rhode 2 movies from way back when, and they found a way to use that feeling in their own show to make their own fun musical adventures. These episodes are the definition of fun, and today I'm going to go over every Rhode 2 episode of Family Guy and rank them on this here nifty tier list. We've got 8 full episodes to get through, so let's jump straight in to the first one.
We're off on the road to Rhode Island.
Rhode to Rhode Island is the first episode of the Rhode 2 series, and it's a really strong start. The story centers around Brian's abandonment issues after being seemingly abandoned by his mother when he was a puppy. Brian is depressed and is drinking to drown his sorrows. But after a chat with Lois, Brian gets the idea to take a trip out to California to pick up Stewie from Lois's parents' house to help clear his head. Brian picks up Stewie, and when they arrive at the airport, Brian gets drunk at the bar, leading to their money and plane tickets getting stolen. Brian decides to lie to Lois about the incident to hide the fact that this was all his fault, and tells her that they decided to take a train back to Rhode Island instead of flying. And this kicks off Brian and Stewie's adventure, with the pair doing their best to find their way back to Rhode Island. There are a bunch of great jokes in this episode that are, for the most part, centered around Brian and Stewie's rapport. And on top of that, the episode does a really great job of building up Brian and Stewie's relationship. They start off somewhat annoyed with each other, but after experiencing a series of trials and bonding over the death of Brian's mother, they become good friends. It's a simple, fun adventure that features a nice emotional moment that resolves an issue that's brought up at the beginning of the episode. Brian grows a bit as a character, and Brian and Stewie's relationship grows into a believable and entertaining friendship. One drawback of this episode, however, is that it features a B-plot centered around Peter and Lois getting a marriage counseling course on VHS. Now, don't get me wrong, this B-plot isn't bad. I actually really like this one. It has one of my favorite jokes in all of Family Guy.
Lois, when have we ever had trouble communicating?
Oh, Peter, I love you.
About 5:15.
So no, I don't think this B-plot is bad. I don't think it makes it a bad episode, but the stuff with Brian and Stewie is so much fun that I wish the episode would have just focused all of its attention on their journey home. Also, this episode botches its ending a little bit. I always remember this episode ending with Brian and Stewie singing, which would have been perfect. But instead of doing that, the episode ends with a pretty lame recurring joke with Chris and Meg. But other than that, I have no other issues with this episode. It's just fantastic, and it's packed with a ton of gags that makes it feel like an homage to classic adventure road trip movies with a musical twist. And for right now, I'm gonna put Rhode to Rhode Island in A tier. On to the next one.
You and I are so awfully different.
Road to Europe shares a lot of similarities with Road to Rhode Island and Road to Rupert, which is the next episode in the Road to series. All three of these episodes are simple, straightforward adventures featuring a fun musical number and great jokes. However, these first three episodes all share the same issue. They all have a B-plot that isn't bad, but definitely takes away from the adventure of the A-plot. In the later episodes of this Road to series, the team behind Family Guy wisely decided to focus all of their attention on Brian and Stewie's adventures. Well, except for one episode, but we'll get to that one later. Road to Europe focuses on Stewie attempting to fly to London on his own so that he can live on Jolly Farm, the fictional setting of Stewie's favorite TV show of the same name. Stewie leaves a note for Brian telling him where he's going, and Brian sets off to stop Stewie. Brian is too late, and the two wind up stuck on a plane that Stewie is certain is headed to London. However, when Brian and Stewie land, they realize that they're not in London, and they're actually in the Middle East. So the pair have to find their way to London so Stewie can try to fulfill his dream of living on Jolly Farm. This episode really feels like a classic globe-trotting adventure, though it's not as fleshed out as it could have been thanks to the episode's B-plot. The B-plot of this episode focuses on Peter going to see Kiss, and if you don't know what Kiss is, then this B-plot will most likely not connect with you in any way. I like some songs from Kiss, but I wouldn't say I'm a fan of Kiss as a band. Most of my knowledge of Kiss comes from my dad, who was a pretty big fan of the band back in their heyday, and Kiss is an iconic and very strange band that I could talk about for hours because of all the marketing and merchandising behind them. I think it's fascinating, but for the sake of this video, I'll just say that this B-plot is fine. I got more out of it than I think the average viewer would today, and it definitely waters down this episode a bit. But I will say, Road to Europe makes the most out of the time they have for the main story. There are a bunch of great gags and another amazing musical number with Brian and Stewie. I also love how Brian goes along with Stewie all the way to London, despite him knowing that Stewie isn't going to like what he sees when he arrives at Jolly Farm. Brian is there for Stewie throughout this whole adventure, and that makes their friendship feel justified by the end of the episode. It's important for these early episodes to really establish Brian and Stewie's friendship, and I think these first two episodes do a really fantastic job of that. This is another fun, entertaining, and funny adventure that stands out as one of the better episodes of Family Guy. I think the B-plot affects this one a lot more than the B-plot in Road to Rhode Island just because the subject matter is so dated today, so I'm just gonna put this one in B tier for B-plot. Like I said earlier, Road to Rupert is fairly similar to Road to Rhode Island and Road to Europe in terms of structure. I think it's best to break up the Road to series of episodes into two categories, with the first being the simple stories and the second being the really crazy ones. These first three episodes are all simple stories that are fun and packed with adventure and humor. The next four episodes are all of the crazy stories that feature things like time travel, interdimensional travel, teleportation, and, well, Christmas, I guess. I guess that one counts as crazy, but you'll see why when we get to that episode. And then, of course, the last episode is another simple story with an A and B plot, giving us a nice split category of 4 crazy stories and 4 simple stories. And frankly, I don't think there's that big of a difference in terms of quality between these two categories. The crazier stories that we'll get to later are all great fun with interesting settings and premises, but sometimes a simpler road trip kind of story is perfectly fine at delivering the same amount of entertainment. But setting that aside, it's time to talk about Road to Rupert. This episode focuses on Stewie's teddy bear Rupert being mistakenly purchased at the Griffin family's yard sale. Brian isn't paying any attention and accidentally sells Rupert to a man who is moving that same day to Aspen, Colorado. Brian does his best to make up for his mistake, but Stewie wants Rupert back, and so the pair set off to Aspen to find Rupert and bring him home. Again, this episode is a fun, simple adventure that has a lot of great jokes and another fun musical number. I remember not enjoying this musical number as much back in the day, mostly because it didn't feature Brian as much as the other musical numbers, and this is because this musical number is mostly a live-action animation hybrid, where Stewie dances with Gene Kelly, which is a lot of fun, but it's also a little strange. The original dance number was from a movie called Anchors Aweigh, and in that movie, Gene Kelly dances with Jerry from Tom and Jerry. I think the dance number is fun and unique, but at the same time, I think it's kind of lame. Anchors Aweigh came out in 1945, and the dance scene was definitely impressive for that time, but for Family Guy to do the same thing with the same footage over 60 years later just feels kind of strange. Although, I think it's safe to say that your average Family Guy viewer isn't watching movies from over 60 years ago, so at least it's a way for this impressive dance number to be seen by a new audience. I'm really conflicted on how to feel about this particular musical number. I definitely prefer the musical numbers from Road to Europe and Road to Rhode Island, but still, I think this episode delivers a fun adventure and it ends in a really funny and unexpected way that I think works really well. You want to know how this episode ends? Too bad, I'm keeping it a secret. Go watch it for yourself. This one's a lot of fun. I'm not going to give away every ending and every little thing about these episodes because I really do want people to check them out if they haven't seen them already. So go check this one out if you want to see the ending. We're not done talking about Road to Rupert yet though, because I have to talk about the B plot, which again takes away from the main story a good bit. Peter loses his driver's license and Meg has to drive him around. And that's the B-plot. It's super forgettable, but it gave us the My Black Son sitcom theme song gag, which is one of my favorite jokes from early Family Guy.
My black son! My black son! Now each day my heart is getting bigger!
All in all, Road to Rupert is another fun adventure, and I'm gonna put this one in B tier. Now buckle up everybody, because these next 4 episodes are all a lot more crazy than the first 3. Road to Germany is the first Road 2 episode to get really crazy with its premise. This time, Brian and Stewie have to go back in time to rescue Mort, who has mistakenly transported himself to Poland right before Germany invades in 1939. When Brian and Stewie arrive in the past and try to escape with Mort, they realize they don't have enough uranium to power Stewie's time machine. So, Brian, Mort, and Stewie have to work together to steal uranium from the Germans in Berlin. These are easily the highest stakes for any of the Road 2 episodes, and I love the sequence where Germany begins their invasion when the episode cuts from the wedding to the tanks charging in, back to the wedding, back to the Germans. It works so well at establishing the seriousness of this situation, and frankly, it's way too well done to be in an episode of Family Guy, but that's the kind of thing you get with these Road 2 episodes. There's just a different level of quality in all of these episodes, except for one, but again, we'll get to that one later. This sequence is just perfect. Road to Germany definitely struggles with the tone from time to time, but that's bound to happen when you're making fun of an incredibly serious and tragic subject like World War II, but as a whole, this episode does a pretty good job at keeping things moving, and it doesn't stop too often to make dumb, disjointed jokes. I was really worried this episode would wind up feeling tasteless or exploitative, but after watching it, it just felt like a fun adventure. This episode has a story that could easily be tweaked to work in a lot of different contexts, and that's the sign of a really great premise. Road to Germany features high stakes, a fun premise, some funny jokes, and the genuine feeling of adventure that comes with a Road 2 episode of Family Guy. I do have one massive complaint when it comes to this episode though, and that is that there is no musical number, and this is not the only Road 2 episode that doesn't feature a musical number. They tease it a bit in this episode like they're gonna do it, but Brian and Stewie are cut off and it doesn't happen. Maybe the writers thought it would feel too out of place, but regardless of whether it would have worked or not, I'm still a little bit disappointed. However, this episode is fantastic. There's no B plot, so it's all focused on the adventure, and I am comfortable putting this one in A tier. It'd be a lot closer to S if it had a musical number, but what are you gonna do?
It's a wonderful day for pie.
Rhode to the Multiverse really feels like the high point of the Rhode 2 series. The Griffin family is enjoying a day at the Quahog Carnival where Stewie has just won a blue ribbon for having the best pig in show. Stewie says it's the most genetically perfect pig in the whole show and offers to show Brian how he got the pig. The two return home, and Stewie shows Brian his new invention, a device that lets Stewie travel across the multiverse. I know multiverse stories are all over the place nowadays, but this episode came out back in 2009, and it does a great job of keeping things interesting with every alternate universe. I feel like it's more common now for multiverse stories to just be a vessel for callbacks and references, and they tend to lack substance. And no, this isn't true of all multiverse stories, but Rhode to the Multiverse feels like a compilation of funny and visually interesting worlds that our two main characters have to sort through to find their way home. There's no B-plot in this episode, which allows the alternate universes to take center stage, and while the logic doesn't always make much sense, like how Brian and Stewie's art styles sometimes changes with the world and then sometimes it doesn't for seemingly no reason, I feel like these nitpicks are easier to ignore because the story moves along at such a steady pace. And unlike Rhode to Germany, Rhode to the Multiverse does feature another fun, catchy musical numbers set in a Disney-style universe. This episode definitely puts fun moments and worlds ahead of logic in terms of how the story unfolds and how the worlds work, but I don't really mind that. So long as the story is fun, who cares if the logic doesn't always add up? I could nitpick things that don't make sense, but that isn't really the point of this episode. It's a simple adventure with a crazy premise where the goal is to get home, and the multiverse acts as a really fun path for Brian and Stewie's adventure. This episode is just so much fun, and I had a really great time watching it for this video. So Rhode to the Multiverse is easily going into S tier. This episode is a perfect Rhode 2 episode, and if you're one of those people that thinks there's no redeeming qualities about Family Guy whatsoever, first of all, you should watch the Rhode 2 series, but if you want one episode to really sell you on the show, this is that episode.
Because Christmas time is killing us. Killing us!
Rhode to the North Pole is easily the most ambitious Rhode 2 episode of Family Guy. This is an hour-long Christmas special featuring a live-action narrator, 2 musical numbers, and what you think is going to be your standard "we've got to save Christmas" story. What makes this episode stand out from the other Christmas specials in Family Guy and in other adult animated shows is just how dark the story is as a whole. After the opening musical number, which is super catchy and sets up the moral theme of the episode, Brian takes Stewie to see Santa at the mall, but as soon as it's Stewie's turn, Santa decides to call it a day and leaves. Stewie, who wholeheartedly believes in Santa, is incredibly upset by this and asks Brian to take him to the North Pole. Now, Brian doesn't believe in Santa, and he knows driving to the North Pole is impossible, but the episode finds a logical way for Brian to play along with Stewie without breaking character. When Brian and Stewie are at the mall, they run into Quagmire, who is also taking a small child to see Santa. Brian mistakenly thinks the child is a boy because of their short hair, but it turns out that this is actually Quagmire's niece, who has cancer. This leads to an incredibly awkward bout of dark humor that sets the tone for the comedy of this whole episode. There's a lot of dark humor in this episode that I don't think is going to work for everyone, whether it's a 5-year-old dying of cancer, Brian and Stewie beating up and tying up a family while filling in for Santa Claus, or the hellscape that is the overworked North Pole. This episode is not very cheerful or lighthearted after the opening musical number. For better or worse, they are going full dark comedy for this episode. But while the episode does really lean into the dark comedy, it all works for the story that's being told. Going back to the scene with Quagmire's niece, this interaction winds up giving Brian motivation to take Stewie to the North Pole, because the rest of the Griffin family is going to see Quagmire and his niece in the hospital. It may be really dark, but it works for the story of this episode. After Brian tries to trick Stewie into thinking a themed Christmas village is the North Pole, Stewie snaps and reveals that he's going to take revenge on Santa for how he treated him at the mall by killing him. From here, Brian and Stewie make their way to the North Pole through a series of hijinks, and it's revealed that the North Pole is in terrible shape. And as soon as Stewie confronts Santa Claus, Santa begins to beg for death at Stewie's hand. Yeah, they're really leaning into that dark comedy, I warned you, and it keeps going from here. Brian and Stewie decide to investigate the North Pole to see what's going on. It turns out that Santa and his elves are being horribly overworked, trying to fulfill everyone's Christmas wishes. Again, this whole section of the episode is incredibly dark, kind of gross, and a bit depressing. I get that the episode is trying to put a dark comedy spin on formulaic Christmas specials, but with this episode being twice as long as the usual episode of Family Guy, it gets to a point where the misery and nightmarish conditions of the North Pole feel ridiculously over the top. We do get another fun musical number in the North Pole, but this whole section of the episode feels like it's been written by an edgy middle schooler. I remember watching this episode while in middle school and really loving it, but now that I'm rewatching it, it doesn't feel quite as funny as it did back then. Some of the dark comedy works for me, but after a while, it just feels like too much. So I think the dark comedy starts to fizzle out a good bit once Brian and Stewie reach the North Pole. But the fun musical numbers and the adventure to the North Pole easily make up for it. And once Brian and Stewie head out to fill in for Santa, the episode sort of resets and you think things are going to become more cheery. But then, the reality of being Santa Claus sets in, and we get more dark comedy that works a good bit better than the scenes in the North Pole. Seeing Brian and Stewie utterly fail to successfully get a single house their presents is pretty funny, and it gives the characters perspective on Santa's issues. So, Christmas is cancelled, and everyone in Quahog is really upset. But Brian and Stewie decide to share the truth about Santa with everyone, and they ask for everyone to calm down a little bit with the presents they are asking for, because if they don't, there won't be another Christmas. Everyone seems to agree, and we skip forward to next Christmas, where everyone is happy to get one reasonable gift, and the North Pole and Santa Claus return to normal. Rhode to the North Pole is an incredibly dark episode, and it definitely drops off in quality at the middle. But I still love Rhode to the North Pole because it succeeds at presenting a new kind of Christmas special that really only Family Guy could get away with. I love the music in this episode, and Brian and Stewie deliver yet another fun adventure, albeit a much darker one than before. This episode definitely stands out from the rest of the Rhode 2 series in a lot of ways, for better or worse, and I'm gonna put Rhode to the North Pole in B tier, although I'd say it's closer to an A than a C, because those two musical numbers are just fantastic. Roads to Vegas is an episode I tend to forget about, and I'm not really sure why. The premise of this episode is incredibly fun and unique, and the setting of Las Vegas is perfect for a fun musical number. However, this episode doesn't feature a musical number, which feels like a huge missed opportunity. But before I get to the lack of a musical number, I have to talk about the premise. Brian wins a pair of tickets to see Celine Dion in Las Vegas, and he asks Stewie to come along with him. Stewie agrees, and they pack their bags and get ready to head off to the airport. But right before they leave, Stewie offers an alternative form of travel that he's recently invented: teleportation. Brian and Stewie decide to give it a try, and it seemingly doesn't work, so they head off to the airport. But it turns out Brian and Stewie were teleported to Las Vegas. But how can that be? Turns out Stewie's teleportation machine sends a pair of copies to the programmed location rather than actually teleporting themselves. So this means that there are two Brians and two Stewies going on the same adventure in different ways at different times. and I absolutely love this premise. It reminds me of an episode of Malcolm in the Middle with a similar premise, where we get to see two different stories play out when Malcolm and Reese are taken to a bowling night, with either Hal or Lois accompanying them. It's such a fun way to present a story, and it works really well in Roads to Vegas. The teleported versions of Brian and Stewie are having incredible luck in Vegas, while the non-teleported versions are having an awful time. Brian and Stewie show up in Las Vegas and realize they can't check into their hotel room because, well, they already have, because the teleported versions of themselves arrived first. The teleported version of Brian gets to a slot machine before the non-teleported version does, and he winds up winning, leaving nothing to pay out for when the other Brian arrives. There are so many moments like this in this episode, and it is just so much fun. The only thing this episode is missing is a fun musical number. I'm not sure why they didn't attempt some kind of musical number, maybe one that's cheery and upbeat for the teleported versions of Brian and Stewie, and then it switches to a more depressing rendition for when the non-teleported versions are singing. I feel like there was a big missed opportunity for a fun musical number, but that's really my only complaint with this episode. Similar to Road to the North Pole, this episode features a good bit of dark humor, but it's nowhere near as overwhelmingly present as it is in Road to the North Pole. And the ending of this episode is fantastic, although it is very dark. I feel like people sleep on this episode a lot, so I'm not going to spoil the ending here in hopes you go and check it out if you haven't seen it. Roads to Vegas is a really fantastic episode that's one musical number short of being my favorite Road to episode of Family Guy. So I'm going to put this one in A tier, with it being closer to an S than a B.
Well, I came across the world for a very special girl.
Road to India is the most recent episode in the Road to series, and it is easily the worst. This episode fails at feeling like an actual adventure, and instead feels like a regular formulaic episode of Family Guy. A lot of this has to do with the episode's B-plot being incredibly uninteresting. Peter goes to bingo with Joe, and starts stealing Joe's friends at the bingo hall. It's a fine premise for a B-plot, I guess, but after seeing a run of episodes that were just focused on Brian and Stewie's adventure, it makes this episode feel like it's going backwards in terms of quality. The adventure Brian and Stewie are going on isn't all that satisfying either. Brian falls in love with an Indian customer service rep over the phone, and he sets off with Stewie to meet her in India. I like the idea of this episode, but the execution is really bland. Brian and Stewie just sort of show up in India, and then they find Padma, the woman Brian has fallen in love with, and there isn't anything fun about how they arrive at their destination, but then it looks like things are going to get more interesting. Padma is stuck in an arranged marriage that hasn't gone through yet, and she invites Brian and Stewie to her engagement party. Once there, Padma reveals that she is in love with Brian and she cannot go through with the arranged marriage. Padma's father is upset at this turn of events and explains that he's already paid a dowry to her husband-to-be's family. Brian then gets the idea to pay Padma's father back the dowry. Brian doesn't have enough money though, so he has to find a way to raise money, and fast. This seems like it would lead to a fun turn of events where Brian is going throughout India trying to find a way to make money fast. But instead, Brian decides to go on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire in a reference to Slumdog Millionaire. Brian immediately fails, which is pretty funny, but it turns out Padma is already out of her arranged marriage, and Brian doesn't have to raise money. So the entire raising money plot point is pointless. But at least Brian and Padma can be together, right? No, they're not together. Padma decides she doesn't want to be with someone who doesn't understand her culture, and Brian has proved he doesn't know anything about her culture after getting the first question wrong on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And then the episode ends with an okay musical number that lacks any kind of substance because the episode as a whole lacks substance. The journey in Road to India isn't fun, the destination of India isn't explored in an interesting way, and the episode as a whole feels like a lazy, thrown together mess that does not live up to the rest of the Road to series of episodes. This one is going in F, and it is the only episode of this entire series of Road to episodes that I do not recommend. I am genuinely dumbfounded by all of the decisions in the execution of this episode, and the fact that they made it a part of the Road to series is just incredibly confusing because it lacks nearly every aspect of what makes those episodes work. It's not adventurous. Brian and Stewie are just kind of there. They're not bonding. They're not singing together. They're not going on some grand adventure. They're just being teleported from location to location with light motivation, and then by the end of the episode, they reveal it was all a waste of time.
This sucked and you failed.
Now that we've reached the end of the road, pun intended, thank you very much, of the Road to series, I'm still really impressed with these episodes. Road to India might be a complete and utter mess of an episode, but the rest are all incredibly fun adventures that feel genuinely inspired. If you haven't seen Family Guy in a while, or you've never seen the show somehow, the Road to series of episodes is a great place to start. You'll get to know two of the most entertaining characters in this show, and you'll understand why people think that. These episodes, with the exception of Road to India, are evidence of real love and care being put into Family Guy, which is a sight that isn't all too common these days. I know it's easy to trash Family Guy, and granted, the show does have a lot of odd and bad episodes, but the Road to episodes are when Family Guy is at its best, and I'd recommend these first 7 episodes to anyone who enjoys adult animation. Hopefully the team behind Family Guy revisits this series at some point, and hopefully they rediscover what worked about them so we avoid another Road to India style episode. To me, what works about the first 7 episodes of the Road to series is that they feel like real adventures. When we get to see Brian and Stewie in a series of new and interesting environments trying to solve a problem, that's when Family Guy is at its best. Maybe one day we'll get to see another episode in the Road to series, but for now, I'm happy with what we got. So let me know how you would rank these episodes in the comment section below, and make sure to check out the first 7 episodes of this Road to series, because I am sure you will not regret it. And with that, we've reached the end of the Road to episodes of Family Guy. Thank you all very much for watching. This is the biggest project I have tackled in a very long time, and it's taken a ton of work. So if you made it this far in the video, thank you very much. I do really appreciate it. I have no idea what I'm going to be talking about next. I know the Five Nights at Freddy's movie is coming out pretty soon. I would love to talk about that because I have an extensive history when it comes to that stuff. So there will probably be a video on that. Depending on how this one does, maybe I'll tackle another series of episodes or just talk about things I like in shows that are kind of falling off recently, but who knows? There's plenty of possibilities. I'm open to suggestions if you want to leave some down in the comment section below, but I'm comfortable leaving this here. I have a lot of editing to do, so wish me luck on that. I guess it's already done when the video goes up, so still wish me luck, because I'm going to edit something else in the future, and luck is good. Goodbye!